Note, this is not a review of Chainsaw Man. I just finished watching the first season of Chainsaw Man. I haven't watched a TV show for years. I typically don't love serial television unless there is a set episode count. But Chainsaw Man checked many boxes that I appreciate aesthetically. In particular, having watched the introduction, I noticed the show contained a feel that is typically present in my favorite media, such as the Master and Margarita, Devilman Crybaby, and The Brothers Karamazov. See a trend in these media? Whether directly or indirectly, they point to the spiritual. Each includes a Christian figure showing up, usually the devil. Chainsaw Man also plays with spiritual matters, yet I am unconvinced that this direct imagery is what I mean when I say contained a feel. Other media I've consumed also include this imagery, but I wouldn't consider them my favorites. Instead, the use of Christian symbolism simply is correlation rather than causation. Correlation in that the use of Christian imagery indicates a proposed mission, namely the attempt to point towards the spiritual. If done correctly, we receive what I have in the past called a feeling of awe. This feeling of awe, I believe, is one avenue to spiritual stirring. In my research and practice, this feeling of awe is resultant of an extreme use of peculiar, causing a feeling of right, more right than regular right.
You know, in my world, the wronger something feels, the righter it is. So to waste this much time on something this stupid that felt good to me.
Jerry uses wrong in place of peculiar, but I fear that wrong comes with the baggage of a negative moral polarity, which is important to avoid as we progress through this blog. So, why did Chainsaw Man catch my eye? It was this feeling of awe, largely nailed in the intro theme as well as the outros, but unfortunately not consistently held during the show's actual runtime. It is not fully absent from the show, leaving me overall not regretful to have watched it. Another piece of media that attempts a spiritual stirring via this avenue is a win in my book. Before we get to the show, let's look at the intro to see what causes this spiritual stirring from the avenue of offness. When I use the term off, I suspect the reader expects one of two things. One, that the weird ethical or sexual distortion shown in the beach shot, in which we see a bikini clad woman in an erotic pose and a man on all fours being led by a woman by means of a dog collar. The second is media rule breaking, best represented in the same shot in which we zoom in on the collar ordeal, showing it at a lower resolution. Neither of these is quite what I mean. That's not to say that they don't play into the effect. Rapid succession of narratively consistent provocative imagery does, perhaps, lower one's guard for a spiritual stirring, but it seems not to produce the correct feeling on its own. And as I consider, perhaps they could play into the spiritual stirring somewhat. My problem here is that they veer past peculiar directly into explicit. The areas instead that shine most are, to me, in the silly dance shared between dingy and power that is chosen to conclude the otherwise mostly otherworldly denouement, as well as the jump cuts during the movie watching scenes, specifically on the eye patch girls posing, are intentionally imperfect but communicate information properly, nonetheless. Another example can be found in the movement on Dingy in the Big Lebowski inspired bowling scene, in which frames are repeated in a rather odd and rhythmic manner. Masaki Uesa, one of my favorites, is a master of this particular technique. All this to say, I don't actually know what causes this type of spiritual stirring, other than something being so peculiar that it becomes more right than right, but not so explicitly peculiar that it reaches the point of absurdism or explicit incorrectness. It is this odd balancing act, however, that I find particularly beautiful. Now, if we look at the show itself, we unfortunately find more typical shonen hype than offness. Not bad necessarily, just not what I expected. Though there are still some solid moments, such as Himeno's character as a whole, but particularly her death. Yes, the plot, yes, from a plot standpoint, we have something very clever in creating an arc for the viewer to anticipate. The pact she and Dingy make to help each other get there with their romantic interests before brutally taking it away via her death. Yet, while this is excellent plotting, it would not really achieve this feeling of off on its own. What really pushes it into this realm is the animation that occurs during the loss of her body parts. They just vanish. A slight clothing rustling audio effect plays rather than anything ceremonious, as one would expect. It is here that we find our offness. Another scene that hits this balance of offness is the Kabini goes berserk scene, particularly in her unworldly run that occurs immediately after her initial avoidance of the snake demon thing. First of all, this is the exact moment in which we truly realize that she is not the scared girl archetype that we'd expected her to be. So once again, we have plotting backing up this strange moment. This backing is followed by just a few frames of particularly bizarre run that does not make physical sense, but is somehow very impactful and creates the sort of offness we would have been looking for. I won't reach the full definition of this offness now, or perhaps any time in the future. This is just the nature of spiritual matters, of which I believe this to be. But before we go, I want to bring up one last thing. Earlier, I mentioned that I'd rather say that something is so peculiar that it circles around and becomes right again than something being wrong, as wrong carries with it the baggage of negative polarity. Let's clarify this. I strongly believe that this peculiarity method of spiritual stirring can point a viewer to heaven or hell, and therefore it is on the shoulders of the artist to be aware of what they intend. I do not believe it is in the artist's control how the user responds, and I believe that God will use it for his plans regardless, but it is in the artist's best interest to be intentional.